Thank you, Peter. Dylan, Pell, really appreciate that. I wanted to address one question since there was a lot of the presentations today talking about having a data catalog. And so how does the data catalog intersect with ontologies, and where would those inherent benefits associated with that be?
Right, I'd be very happy to take that one, Steve. So the data catalog, we have a good instance of that when it comes to the W3C data catalog vocabulary, but these things can be expressed in other ontologies as well. Is that we have a catalog which is managed, governed by a single cataloger, if you want, a single organization that's pulling together whatever that organization considers are important catalogable assets. And they may be different sorts of things. They may be an item that's going to contain data for which they have need for an identifier for it, for metadata, for other things to describe what is going to be in that catalog. There may then be data sets that are in that catalog, but those data sets may not necessarily be available in their entirety. They may be available as items distributed from a service. And so the data catalog is going to hold on to all these sorts of things, which are essentially metadata about everything that is under the FAIR principles. The catalog itself helps make the data set findable. Whether or not you've got permissions to access it, whether or not you've got a route to access it, is the A in FAIR. Is it interoperable? Well, we don't know. What sort of forms can you get the data out in? If it's only available in a PDF, yes, it's a data catalog. Yes, you've got the data set, but it's not really interoperable with your Excel spreadsheet or something like that. And then there are rights and obligations and other things of that sort that are associated with data. So what is it available to be used for? Can it be repurposed? And at that level, we move away from a data catalog in its strictest sense and start looking at whether the data elements that are in the data set actually match what I'm looking for, whether they have the granularity that's relevant for me to use in my work, whether I can make any sense of the data. And this is where profiles and other things like that, which are at a more fine-grained level on each data set, might be relevant. You're muted, Steve.
Sorry about that. I'd say the other question, and this is one that I know, great deal of familiarity with traditional data management practices around taxonomies.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's some similarities between ontologies and taxonomies. Maybe one of you can explain a little bit more as to, those differences and where those tend to intersect, and of course how semantic arts uses each of those in order to enrich that knowledge and representation.
I'd be happy to take an initial stab at that one. So for us on a lot of our projects, we're using both. We're using both ontologies and taxonomies, but there is generally an important distinction between them, which is that, and this is something that Peter hit on at the tail end of the presentation there, is, there can be just purely taxonomical hierarchies where we're just talking about buckets of things that we can group things into. And that can be a very useful tool to have. But ontologies take things a step further. They go beyond just mere classification of things into these buckets, but they also develop formal definitions that include generalizations about the properties that things happen to have. And when you get to these more complex definitions, these more complex formalizations of these classes, this is something that really is something that allows you to state the meaning of classes in more rich terms, but it also is something that enables the kind of reasoning that we were talking about as well. It's not just simple class subsumption, but you'll get some other potential inferences like inferences on the properties. You can state that properties are transitive, or you can state that they have other types of properties like they're symmetric. And a lot of the power of the ontology will come from that.
So one more thing about the interplay between a taxonomy and an ontology. I think it is helpful to note that these ways of doing things come from very similar places. So initially, when you are, a lot of this came from library science. You want to organize all your books in a way that they're findable. You want to organize all your data in a way that makes sense. So starting off in libraries, you started with just simple lists of tags. Here are the words that you can use. There's 50 of them. This makes sure that we're all on the same page and we're all tagging things in the right way. So that's just a simple enumerated list. That's a controlled vocabulary. You can only use these words. Then it gets a little bit more complex and it becomes a taxonomy. We start to say, okay, well, here's one term. It's a very broad term. And then here's two slightly narrower terms. And they're related to that broader term in that they are narrower than. They're a specification of this term. And that's the taxonomy. We sort things into terms and then terms that contain other terms. So animal is a term. It contains mammals, reptiles. And then you can make a thesaurus, often used with SCOS. So a thesaurus specifies this word is an alternate label. This word is the one preferred label. But if you read the alternate label, you know that you're talking about the preferred label. So it specifies synonymy. So now you can have a little bit more freedom in tagging, and then you can use the thesaurus to say, okay, well, these two tags mean the same thing. And then you get even more complicated, and you say, okay, well, these two tags denote certain classes, and those classes have these definitions, and that's where you get an ontology. So these things grow very sequentially.
Thank you, Pell. I know that Dan had a question that I think Joaquin put out onto the panelists. I don't know if somebody wants to volunteer to grab that one.
Yeah, I can answer this one as well. I would be curious for Dave's thoughts on this one. And I see Michael has put some thoughts as well. And I think I would tend to agree with them, is that, maybe it would be possible to achieve data centricity to some extent without having an upper ontology that you can use for subsumption reasoning, but it could be a little more difficult. And I would think if you weren't starting from an upper ontology, there might be a temptation to stick with some of the concepts that are present in a database or an application that you might already be using. And if you didn't have those two, of course, you would lose out on some of the benefits that you get from that kind of reasoning. So that's my initial thought on that.
But I think, going back to it, that making use of a very rich set of equivalent classes with an appropriate set of carefully prepared predicates. It is, after all, the predicates that enable you to do much of the reasoning about things like whether or not a relationship is symmetrical or transitive, or what an inverse is. That we would be able to provide an extremely rich data-centric buckyball of interrelated data and definitions for them. The only thing missing being the class subclass hierarchy, but I'm sure that you could relate with other relationships between equivalent classes and things like that. That will give you an extremely useful, rich set of data descriptions.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Joaquin, did you want to pull up the Andres question there? Any of the panelists want to tackle that one?
I can. So Rebecca's in the chat, and Michael have talked a little bit about this in their messages. But equivalent classes, as we were mentioning, are less of saying, like, here's a class that I've named and defined, and here's one that I named and defined. They're actually the same thing. So if you were to do that, then you would have made redundant classes. But so with GIST, where our equivalent classes are, we'll say, here's a named class. It's equivalent to this axiomatic semantic description of what it means. So we're saying the class is equivalent to this definition.
Yeah.
So am I on now?
You are on.
Good. So I wanted to go back to Dan's question. The first part is, there is an existence proof that somebody can be data-centric without subsumption. And it was kind of a weird one. I used to have this 10-question questionnaire that I would send out to people. So you think you're data-centric? And they would check all the check boxes and get a terrible score. But somebody got a very good score. And I thought, wow, that's kind of surprising. I never heard of these guys. And I called them up and interviewed them. I eventually flew out to Richmond and met with them and just had a great time. And these guys, it was kind of amazing. The company was very small in the year 2000, and they built a model-driven development environment around relational, and they've grown it up and been acquired and kept growing. It's now part of Standard & Poor's. It's Standard & Poor's Market Intelligence, and they have 8,000 classes. There's no subsumption, and yet there's only one model for the whole company. And it's all model driven. It's a pretty incredible piece of work. But as a couple of people, Michael said here, that was hard. And it's hard to have 8,000 classes in your core and actually convince yourself that there's really 8,000 distinctions. Because what really goes on, if you have a very elegant enterprise ontology, you might have 500 classes. And if there's no subsumption, every time you go out and interview somebody and they tell you about some weird concept that they have, your inclination is to just come back and make a new 501st class and not realize that it is actually very closely related. So instead, if you have a lot of discipline, and before you even got to 500, every time you get a new one, you say, like at the top level of GIST, which one of these 14 is it really? And how does it differ from these other ones? And that is kind of the self-organizing thing that keeps the whole thing simple enough to be understandable. So that's my 2 cents.
And Dave, wasn't another factor associated with S&P is that those individuals that created that, they were all long-term employees. There hadn't been much, people moving to other organizations. And so it was the same people. So they could conform mentally with that model.
Yeah, they were at it for 20 years. It was incredible, but, full credit to them. But anybody else who wants to follow in their footsteps, I think there's easier ways.
Mhm. Well, why did they body swerve subsumption then, Dave?
Because they were doing it in the year 2000 on a relational database,
Oh,
right?
okay.
I mean, what else
Yeah.
are you going to do?
Sure.
And once they got going, there was no logical time to, let's rethink this. I got 7,000 classes. Next year I'll have 7,500, okay.
Mhm.
Well, Joaquin, do we want to wrap it here, or do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, let's put a bow on it. If we can get a final round of thoughts or pieces of advice for people that are undertaking this data-centric architecture journey, but they don't want to start from scratch, as Dave is saying. There's GIST and there's other ontologies. Any words of advice that you can impart to the beginners of the journey?
Pick something that is actively maintained and not something that's possibly tumbleweed and you don't realize it.
Yep.
Dylan, Pell, Dave?
Yeah, I would say something similar to Peter. We use GIST.
Right. That's what I would say. It's free. It's vetted. Go ahead.
And we have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of related to that last question. It's perfectly possible to do all sorts of things, but sometimes it's a lot harder. Like I use a calculator when I'm doing math problems because it's way easier, and why wouldn't I use it? So you could start from scratch and use no upper ontology, or you could use a defunct upper ontology. You could do all this stuff, but there's better ways to do it. There's easier ways to do it. And it's just a matter of determining what's best for you and then finding that thing that fits.
Excellent. Well, I think we've had there's one more thing coming in. Yeah, Rebecca saying their session tomorrow will provide more reasons to use JIT and illustrate on how to use it. So this is just a jumping off platform, a trampoline. But yeah, tomorrow we're going to get more into the concrete details. So we'll take a really, really brief break. We'll reset, and then Steve and I will be closing out the day's festivities. So we'll see you all very soon, and thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your knowledge.